like a whole raft of like totally disastrous, awful things that have happened to the Russian economy as a result of this war. And in the long term, of course, those all chickens are all going to come home to roost. But right now, and that's what we're concerned about since we're talking about the Ukrainian war. Right now, unfortunately, the the oil exports are allowing Putin to essentially take the expenses of this war in his stride.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for TimesRadio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're talking about the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined once again by Owen Matthews, a writer, historian and Russia correspondent for The Spectator. Owen's also the former Moscow and Istanbul bureau chief for Newsweek. Owen, welcome back to Frontline.
Good to be on.
You wrote recently for The Spectator about how Russia is able to circumvent economic sanctions, in particular when it comes to oil exports. Can you just tell us a bit more about the Russian shadow fleet that you've been writing about?
Yeah, the whole package of Western economic sanctions was meant to be a kind of silver bullet to avoid getting into a shooting war with Russia over Ukraine. And when they were introduced, there was strong confidence in the US and the EU that a massive exodus of foreign companies from Russia, that around 16,000 different sanctions on individuals, on financial transactions, and so on, that would all bring the Russian economy to its knees. But that hasn't happened, and that's had an enormous impact on Russia's ability to fight the war. In other words, Russia has been able to take the war and its massive expenses in its stride. And the way it's been able to do that is by maintaining its exports of oil. And it's done that essentially by shifting its customer base from selling directly to Europe to selling to India, China, Indonesia, and other countries that don't have any strong views on the war. They don't care about sanctions, and they've done that partly by creating a fleet of oil tankers that are essentially not registered within the G7 and are able to ship about 55% of Russia's exported oil in tankers that are essentially off the books.
And the West originally did try and damage Russia's economy by capping the price of oil for Russian exports at $60 a barrel. How did they hope to enforce that?
Yeah, it's really important to unpack this because lots of people think that the West is sanctioning Russian oil by stopping Russia from exporting oil. Not true at all. What they're doing is trying to slightly depress the profit that Russia gets from oil by capping the price, as you say, at $60 a barrel. Now, the world price of crude is currently about $78 a barrel. That's for Brent crude. Russian crude operates at a discount at about $74 a barrel. So basically, you're trying to knock $14 a barrel off the price. I mean, that's a sanction, but it's not a ban by any means. So let's really get that straight, is that actually even in a world where there was no Russian shadow fleet, where sanctions were being perfectly enforced, Russia would still make a gigantic profit and a huge income from its oil. And the bottom line is that price cap between $60, which they're meant to get, and $74, which they will get on the open market, is very easily circumvented. You can have all kinds of accountancy tricks, which is called attestation fraud. You just basically add on extra sort of costs for freight and insurance. You load it on, all the papers say it's $60 a barrel, that's the contract price, but actually, with all the add-ons, you can sell it for much closer to the world market price. You can pump the oil from one tanker to another. There's no way of identifying Russian crude particularly. So that's been happening in terms of by means of ship-to-ship transfers. Literally, one tanker pumps oil into another tanker off the coast of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, off the coast of the Peloponnese in Greece. It's a very common practice. It's just basically fraud. Or a third way is that the Russian companies can just sell to their own subsidiaries in Europe. I think some people would be surprised to learn that major Russian private oil companies such as Lukoil still have major refinery operations in Bulgaria, in Romania. They have nearly 50% stake in a major refinery in the Netherlands and so on. And it's very easy to sell for a Russian company to sell to its own subsidiaries at a legal price and then recover that difference further down the line once it's been refined and processed. So essentially, Russia has been able to completely ignore the oil price cap and continue to export actually almost as much, in fact, as much oil as was exporting before the war, and doing so at a higher price.
It's a crucial point you make, Owen, that when people think of Western sanctions on Russian oil, they may think of a total ban, but it's very much not that. It is, as you say, a limiting of their profits. Just for sake of argument, why couldn't there be a total ban? What impact would that have?
If you want oil to be $300 a barrel, and to spend £300 filling your car, then you can do that. Russia exports too much oil. That's the problem, and it's really significant that even right at the beginning of the war, when enthusiasm for sanctions was at its height, oil and gas were not sanctioned by the EU. They were not, especially not gas. So it's ironic that we here in the West intended to bring Russia to our knees, but we could not afford to cut off the Russian gas that was flowing mostly through the Nord Stream pipeline, which was destroyed in September 2022 by unknown saboteurs, but probably Ukrainian. I think there's a very strong balance of evidence that suggests that it was Ukrainian actors that destroyed Nord Stream. But the EU was never able to afford sanctioning that gas, banning that gas and banning that oil. Russia is the third largest exporter of oil in the world. If it produces around 10 million barrels a day. It exports about 5 million barrels of oil a day. If you take 5 million barrels of oil a day off the international market, then the price spikes by twice. And that would actually leave Russia, even if it put a dent in Russia's ability to export that oil, the gigantic price jump would actually more than compensate in financial terms for any potential loss or sanction or blockade of its seaborne oil. So it's a kind of catch-22 situation. There's actually technically it's very difficult to prevent Russia from exporting oil to customers who legally want to buy it. And furthermore, even if there were a way of doing that, then it would impose massive costs on the West economically, and paradoxically, actually, pretty quickly collapse public support for sanctions.
What about the impact, Owen, of Ukraine's repeated strikes on Russian oil refineries? Is that having much of an impact on the Russian economy?
Well, yes, it is. It seems that nearly half of Russian refinery capacity in Western Europe has been struck or affected in some ways by Ukrainian long-range drone strikes. And it's reportedly knocked out about 15% of refinery capacity. And that had an immediate knock-on effect in the sense that ordinary Russians were paying much higher prices for refined petroleum products, basically petrol that they put in cars. So it did have a short-term economic effect. But actually the reality is that, according to Russian reports, so we don't know exactly how reliable they are, but they've actually been able to repair those damaged refineries pretty quickly. So the bigger question is, why don't the Ukrainians actually hit the Russian oil industry harder? Well, there's a political reason for that, and that is that the Americans, who have been providing the lion's share of the military aid that Ukraine relies on, have pretty explicitly told the Ukrainians to refrain from striking at the sort of most vital elements of Russia's oil production capabilities. And the reasons for that are partly because the Americans, they want to see a massive oil shock um, in an election year. And also, right from the beginning of the war, the US administration has been absolutely crystal clear that one of their absolute top priorities, in addition to helping Ukraine not to be overrun by Russian forces, but like the second top priority has been to avoid getting embroiled in a kinetic war, in a direct war between NATO and Russia. And the Ukrainians are, for obvious reasons, kind of very angry about that. Those deep strikes, those drone strikes, are pretty much the only thing that Ukraine's been able to do to directly sort of harm Russia, in addition to, of course, hitting airplanes on the ground and destroying military infrastructure. But those drone strikes were like a major new front for the Ukrainians. But they've been told, basically in no uncertain terms, to cease and desist, or to scale down those attacks using their own drones. And furthermore, the United States has expressly forbidden the Ukrainians from using any US provided rocketry missiles to attack within Russia proper.
To go back to the point about sanctions, do you think the West needs to be more creative in terms of sanctions? Is it time, as William Hague wrote about a few months ago in the Times, to, for an example, look at using seized Russian assets to fund humanitarian aid and military aid in Ukraine? Do we need to look again at sanctions and be more creative?
Yeah, that's the big debate. So while it's not exactly clear how much Russian state money is in Western banks, there's some debate about whether they've actually succeeded in recovering some of that money. But in theory, there's about $350 billion worth of Russian state assets lodged in Europe, in the United States. They're basically sovereign investments. So the question is, from a point of view of ethics, sure, it makes total sense that we punish the Russian government by seizing Russian state money. The question is how to do that while preserving the international order. So, and that gets down to, it sounds like a sort of technicality, but actually it's more than technicality, because if if we're going to put some sort of clear blue water between us and the Russians, and we, the West, and the Russians, then actually there has to be, if we're fighting for anything, it's really for the rule of law. And if you just go around confiscating people's assets because you happen to politically disagree with them, that's the kind of thing that Putin does. So there's like a major legal and ethical debate going on in the West, is who can authorize those assets to be seized. And furthermore, there doesn't exist, and it's kind of part of the more general breakdown of the rules-based order. The only potential institution in the world that could maybe have the authority to do that is the United Nations. But as we all know, Russia has a veto on the United Nations, the Security Council. So the sort of compromise that's being looked at right now is not seizing those assets that are currently frozen, is not literally taking them away and handing them over to Ukraine. It's using the income that those assets have generated in order to fund Ukraine reconstruction. So that's and I think there is a moral case for doing that, and it's legally easier to do that because the income generated by the Russian state assets, since they're frozen, technically doesn't belong to Russia because they've been generated since they've been frozen. But there's actually no legal basis for freezing those assets in the first place. And that's kind of the problem with all of these asset freezes against the Russian state, or indeed against Russian individuals. It's very hard to prove in a court of law that this person has actually engaged in any legal activity. And once again, if the West stands for rule of law, you can't just confiscate money and assets for political reasons. You have to actually prove these people are guilty of something.
I suppose the counter argument would be if they're already frozen and there's no legal basis for freezing them, there's already been a new legal precedent set. And also, are these assets ever going to be returned to the Russian oligarchs who owned them originally? So why not use them for this purpose?
Well, no legal precedent has been set because there's been no legal ruling. It's just an administrative measure. That's the whole point, is there hasn't been a legal precedent. In fact, there's, if you're talking about legal precedents, it's been in exactly the opposite direction, because I have several individuals have had their assets frozen, have successfully challenged those freezes. And actually, what is the basis of freezing the assets of an individual who happens to be a Russian businessman? He's not a member of the Kremlin administration. He's not a member of the Russian government. Sure, anyone who's done Russia has had to deal with the Russian state, but you could say that of anyone any Chinese businessman for that matter. So I think in the broader context, I think there's a lot of there's a lot of danger and international jeopardy in going down that road. And it's not really about Russian assets, foreign assets in Russia, for instance, that are at risk, because there basically are very few major foreign investors left in Russia. I mean, there's and many of those, like Danone, for instance, the dairy company, have already essentially had all their assets just totally illegally expropriated by the Russians already, because the Russians don't care about the rule of law. But I think that the bigger sort of issue going forward is if the West does it to the Russian state assets and to individuals who are associated with the Russian state, then, for instance, China could do precisely the same in a future conflict to US and Western investments in China, for instance, and that would be okay, because it would be the West that had set the precedent. So there is a reason that the West is proceeding with caution, and it's not just pusillanimity, it's not just cowardice. There's this is a dangerous thing to do, and it's a dangerous precedent to set, especially when it comes to confiscating individuals' assets. That's just political persecution unless you can prove in a court of law that they've been guilty of criminality.
Might it not, though, increase the pressure on Putin personally in his position within Russia? Because one of the arguments made early on, after the full-scale invasion happened, when some of these sanctions were first introduced, was that if you could target the oligarchs and those with power and influence in Moscow, then you would apply pressure on Putin and they might start agitating against Putin. Is there any credence to that?
Well, you're completely right. That was the logic, and it was actually the logic. A good friend of mine worked for the Obama administration and was basically sort of one of the major architects of the original, sort of OG sanctions that were introduced back in 2014 over Crimea, and that was precisely the logic. We're going to punish the people around Putin, the oligarchs. They're going to put pressure on Putin, and he's going to be in trouble. 1,000,000% didn't happen. Completely untrue. That logic was utterly flawed, and in fact it kind of had the precisely opposite effect, because the paradox was that even before 2014 Putin began a campaign that he called de-offshorization. In other words, he announced like an amnesty for assets that were brought back from abroad. He was pressuring the Russian elite to bring back their assets from the West. So basically, by targeting the oligarchs, the West is doing Putin's work for him. He doesn't want these people to have all their money outside Russia. He doesn't want all this like stolen money buying yachts in the south of France and so on. He wants it back in Russia. And what we've seen since 2022 is actually a large number of very wealthy individuals have basically attempted to flee Russia and put some distance between themselves and the Kremlin regime, and just sort of retire to a happy life in the West with their assets. They found their assets frozen, and essentially just returned back home. A very good example of this is one of the original 1990s oligarchs called Mikhail Friedman. He got into incredible trouble with. He wasn't convicted of anything, yet his assets were frozen, and he basically ended up back in Russia. So actually, it's strengthening the Putin regime not weakening it. If you wanted to weaken it, you would do the opposite. You would say, oligarchs, we want your money. It will be safe. Take every penny that you can from Russia and flee. Live in Mayfair. That's fine, because actually you're taking money out of Russia. By sanctioning the oligarchs, you're forcing them to take, you've frozen the money that they have in Russia, but you're actually just forcing them to return and sort of make new deals, new compromises with the Putin regime, return whatever assets they can save back to Russia and so on. The assets on the sanctions on oligarchs have not weakened the Putin regime; they've strengthened it.
That is fascinating, and that partially answers my next question. But I wonder if there's another solution you can think of. What could work against Putin? What type of sanctions? Are there any types of sanctions that would work to destabilize the Putin regime?
There is. America could double its oil production, drop the price of oil to $30 a barrel, and the Putin regime would collapse in 6 months. That's how you do it. And
is it that straightforward?
You don't restrict Russian oil. You encourage. You say, like, export more oil. We want more of your oil. Persuade the Saudis, because part of the reason why the oil is close to $80 a barrel is because last year Saudi Arabia and OPEC, who are the major swing producers, as they're called, of petroleum of oil, reduced their production capacity in order to push up prices, because that's what OPEC and the major oil production companies do. They vary their production in order to have an influence on oil prices. And your question is it that simple? Well, it's actually already been done, and it worked. In the 1980s, in a nutshell, from 1983 onwards, Saudi Arabia, under strong political pressure from the United States, and in protest at the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, started massively opening the taps and dropped the price of oil by the mid-1980s to around $12 a barrel, 12. And from 1986 onwards, the Soviet Union was just completely unable to pay its bills and actually had to seek out its first sovereign loan from Deutsche Bank. And actually, the Soviet Union couldn't work because the centralized production, the centralized communist economy, was not producing. It was entirely reliant on high oil prices after the first oil shock of 1973. So for that decade, 1973 and to the mid-1980s, Brezhnev's Russia, the Soviet Union, just lived on oil revenue, just as Putin's does today. So if you drop the oil price by 50%, it went down to $40, $30 a barrel, the Russian economy doesn't balance. It just runs out of money extremely quickly. So sadly, that's really the end. If you're talking about actual, trying to do it through economics, that seems to be the only feasible way to proceed, because the alternative, none of the alternatives are really viable. And just to recap, if you ban Russia's exports of oil, the world price of oil massively rises. Russia benefits anyway. If you try and impose the price cap, they just find ways around it. And if freezing the Russian state assets, or confiscating the Russian state assets, again, they're already frozen, so that doesn't really affect them right now. I mean, they are, and they don't really need those assets that they have abroad, because in 2023, Russia had the highest state budget income on record. It's making more money than it ever has. And furthermore, the Russian economy is set to grow this year more than any G7 country. Its budget deficit, it was like the budget deficit last year was 1.9%, close to 2% of GDP. By the way, America's is 6.5% of GDP. This year, they're pretty close to balancing their budget. Russia is pretty close to balancing its budget. They're expected to have a budget deficit of 0.8% of GDP. And that's despite the fact that they're spending 40% of their government spending on the war. It's insane. I mean, none of this should be true. Russia is richer than ever. It's balanced. It's growing faster than ever. Its budget is balanced because of one thing, because it still maintained its oil export capacity. That's the only thing that's going right for Russia economically. But unfortunately for Ukraine and for those who want to bring Russia to its knees and punish it, that one thing that is going right pays for everything else that's going wrong.
So why doesn't America do as you suggest? Why doesn't America ramp up its own oil production and try and drive down the global price of oil to hurt Russia?
Well, it kind of already is, actually. Already, actually, this week today, America became the biggest exporter of liquefied natural gas in the world. There has been quite a lot of resistance to opening up new oil fields, particularly like the Alaska XL pipeline. You may have heard about that. That was basically sort of put on hold for environmental reasons. Trump was trying to push it through. Then it got suspended. I mean, in theory, hydraulic fracturing is the fracking, which has over the last 15 years created this gigantic explosion of oil and gas production in the United States, and has transformed the US from a net importer of oil to a massive exporter of oil and gas. Fracking partly depends on high oil prices. That's kind of the problem, because the cost of extraction of a barrel of oil varies enormously depending on where it is and the geology and all kinds of technical things. But the bottom line is that the Saudis can extract their oil at around $7 a barrel. That's the production cost. Whereas if you have to use hydraulic fracturing, as the Americans and the Canadians do, it's more the break-even point is much higher. And then, of course, you have to add tax to that. So fracked oil is has a cost of up to $40 a barrel, plus tax. So the irony is, to answer your question, why doesn't the United States just ramp up its production and drop the prices? Is because if you drop the prices, its entire oil industry goes out of business. Unfortunately, it's kind of such sort of,
because it'd be losing money because its production costs would be higher than the cost of the oil.
Yeah, so it's sort of a maddening sort of swings and roundabout situation, and unfortunately, Russia. The Russian state has been spectacularly stupid in launching the war at all. It was unbelievably badly informed about the political and military conditions in Ukraine. There's all kinds of massive screw-ups and idiocies inherent in the way the Kremlin has approached this war. But the one thing that the Kremlin is actually super smart about is that they have this amazing economic team that actually have managed to, brilliantly steer public finances and manage the sovereign wealth funds and, very, very quickly adapt the Russian economy to, getting around sanctions and absorbing costs of the war and so on. There's actually very good economists working at the Kremlin and the Russian Central Bank, and they've, done the deep thinking about this. And the result of it is that they actually have put the Russian economy in a far more even keel, despite fighting a massive war, than any economy in the West, certainly the British economy, sadly.
And just finally, Owen, is the Russian growth rate sustainable? They've obviously moved the economy onto a war footing, but what is the impact on living standards of ordinary Russians? Could that have a political pressure on Putin? And is the growth rate sustainable?
Well, that's an excellent question, because actually, what you have is what economists call military Keynesianism. Keynesianism is like, if the government spends lots of money, then the economy grows. It's what Theodore says. It's what President Roosevelt did in the 1930s. Just poured tons of money into building dams and roads, and you employ tons of people. You prime the pump, and this idea that if the state pours tons of money into the economy grows. So yes, you're right to ask that question, how much of this is just fake growth caused by this by massive military spending. Well, largely it is fake growth, and it's not sustainable growth. It's just government spending of oil money on the war effort. And On a more fundamental level, the war has completely screwed Russia in terms of, of development. Russia's been cut off from international capital markets. They've expropriated and screwed over all foreign investors. You'd have to be completely insane to invest money in Russia. Foreign specialists will not work there, and you kind of need those kind of people if you're going to want to develop, save your aging oil and gas industry. There's all kinds of the entire Russian banking system has been basically isolated from the West. You have 1 million people, overwhelmingly young, educated professionals who have fled the country because of the war. There's like a whole raft of like totally disastrous, awful things that have happened to the Russian economy as a result of this war. And in the long term, of course, those all chickens are all going to come home to roost. But right now, and that's what we're concerned about since we're talking about the Ukrainian war, right now, unfortunately, the oil exports are allowing Putin to essentially take the expenses of this war in his stride and continue to bombard mercilessly Ukrainian towns, mostly from warplanes launched inside Russia. By the way, they're not even using Ukrainian airspace. And the political losses, the political system seems to be remarkably enough sustainable. People don't really appreciate the war has an economic cost, and I very often see people who, in fact, just a couple of days ago, who come back and forth from Russia. It just seems to be absolutely fine. The war is invisible. Everyone just gets on with their lives, and everyone is in this sort of state of denial. There are three things that need to go wrong for the Putin regime to fall, and the same three things that went wrong in Russia in 1917, same three things that went wrong in Russia in 1991, last two regime collapses in recent Russian history, and that is, you have to have a economic crisis, a palpable, deep economic crisis. You have to have a government, a state that's completely discredited itself and proved itself incapable of governing, and you need to have like a clear alternative successor to power. And none of those three things pertain in Putin's Russia today.
Owen Matthews, always appreciate your insight and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
My great pleasure.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.